Today we're going to look at chapter 17 and what's called contract verbs. We're still inside the present active indicative, so we haven't gone anywhere else in those paradigms. But contract verbs are a special kind of verb, and so I wanted to talk about it at this point. Contract verbs are verbs whose stems end in alpha, epsilon, or omicron. In other words, just a whole class of verbs that are their final stem letter is going to be one of those three vowels. And that final vowel is called a contract vowel. And the reason for the name and the reason for the need for a chapter on contract verbs is that when that final contract vowel comes into contact with the connecting vowel, those two vowels contract. In other words, they change into something else normally. And so we have to look at how these contract verbs function. Now, one of the nice things about contract verbs is that once you've learned, for example, poieo, an epsilon contract, you then know how all epsilon contracts behave. All right? So there's three patterns, but once you learn an example of one verb in one pattern, you know how all the other verbs in that same pattern are going to function, okay? Actually, in one sense, having to learn the rules of contraction are not a big deal because almost always you can figure out what they are without understanding the contraction. In other words, if you saw poiumen, even if you don't know the lexical form of this word, what is it? Person and number. First person plural. You got the men there. And if you've done your vocabulary, you'll know that there's a verb poieo, happens to be an epsilon contract. But you would look at that and you say, well, I may not fully understand why there's an omicron upsilon. That's the contraction. But I can tell that it's from poieo and I can tell that it's first person plural. Now, we do need to learn the rules of contraction because you need to be able to go backwards. You need to be able to look at the u, figure out what the final stem vowel of the verb really is, because you're going to have to go figure out what it means, and you can't figure out what it means unless you can look it up in the lexicon. So you do need to be able to work backwards through the contractions. But in terms of parsing, these words are very straightforward. There's a verb pleirao, an omicron contract that means to fulfill. What is pleirute? Second person plural. There's a verb agapao. I have to look at this one carefully. What's this? It's a second person singular, right? Look at the iota. It went under a long vowel. Same thing we had in the dative singulars, right? See, these rules that I'm teaching you don't apply just to the one example. We're going to see them being applied over and over again. Notice one other consistency throughout these three examples. Where's the accent? In the present indicative, contract verbs are always accented on the contracting vowels over the contract syllable. And that circumflex can become a little clue as to say, oh, that's right, contract vowel, present indicative. Just a couple of others. This is another example of the verb poieo, epsilon contract, but how would you parse poio? Yeah, you may not know why the epsilon's gone, but you know it's got to be a first person singular, right? Well, one of the peculiarities of contract verbs is that if you have like poieo, the only place you're ever going to see the epsilon is in the lexicon. Because the lexicons list their words in their uncontracted form. Otherwise, you'd never know what that contract vowel is. So in the lexicons, we uncontract it, so you get poieo, agapao, pleirao. But when they actually occur in the text, the contraction has occurred, and the contract vowel has been swallowed up by the omega. Agaposi has to be a third person plural. You go, where'd the omega, where'd the upsilon go? That thing swallowed up two vowels. Actually, three. Okay, all this was just to say that in terms of parsing, the contractions are not a big deal. If you know your endings and if you know your vocabulary, you can still parse these things. Okay, having said that, there are several rules of contraction you need to learn. The first 5 I call the big 5. They're the most important because they occur the most frequently. There are a few other rules, especially with diphthongs, and be sure you read them carefully in the textbook. So let's just cover the 5 rules of contraction quickly. Rule 1 is that if you find omicron upsilon, there's 3 possible vowel combinations between contract vowel and connecting vowel that could have formed U. And they are epsilon omicron, omicron epsilon, or omicron omicron. In other words, if you saw poiumen, there's 3 possible combinations that could create the U. Now, it doesn't matter for parsing, but it does matter to get back to the lexical form. You have to be able to figure out what that final contract vowel is. But now there's a clue here. Could this possibly be omicron epsilon? Why not? Right. Because the personal ending begins with the mu, and therefore you know that the second vowel of the contraction has to be an omicron. So use what you know in figuring these things out. And so you can always figure out what the second vowel is because of the personal ending. So poiumen is a first person plural from poieo. It's an epsilon omicron contract. How would you know that this is not poiao, an omicron contract verb? Memory. I mean, what would happen is if you didn't know the verb and you would look it up and you may guess that it's an omicron contract, you'd go to poiao and you wouldn't find an entry. Oh, there must be an epsilon contract. Now, the fact of the matter is most contracts are epsilon contracts, then alpha contracts, then omicron contracts. And in fact, there's no present indicative of any omicron contract that occurs more than 50 times in the New Testament. That's why there's no omicron contract examples in the exercises, because there aren't any in the Bible with words that occur 50 times or more. But in pecking order, in frequency order, it's epsilon, then alpha, then omicron. Pleurute. What's the second vowel? Has to be an epsilon because of the te. So this has got to be pleurute from pleurao, omicron contract. The second rule is that epsilon iota is formed by epsilon epsilon. So if you see poieta with an epsilon iota, you know the second vowel has to be an epsilon, but it's really irrelevant because it has to be an epsilon epsilon, and therefore you know that the lexical form is poieo. Can't be anything else. Rule 3 is that an omicron or an omega almost always contract with anything to form an omega, except for those combinations in Rule 1. Now let me say it another way. If it's an omega, it absorbs everything. If it's an omicron and it's some combination other than Rule 1, it also will go to an omega. So you have agapomen, and the only way you're going to know the contract vowel on this one is memory work, but it's an alpha omicron has contracted to omega. Agaposi, you have an alpha omicron upsilon, and it's gone to an omega. So when you have omegas, they swallow up everything. When you have omicrons other than Rule 1, they go to omegas as well. And Rules 4 and 5 could actually be one rule if you wanted to, and that is when it comes to a combination of alpha and epsilon, whichever one comes first wins. Alpha lengthens to a long alpha, so alpha epsilon goes to alpha. Epsilon lengthens to an eta, so epsilon alpha goes to eta. So in the alpha epsilon or epsilon alpha contracts, it all depends upon which one comes first.